What happens when one of the most powerful women in Hollywood sits across from one of the most outspoken hosts on daytime television and refuses to back down from a single word? Because what went down between Viola Davis and Joy Behar on The View was not your typical celebrity interview. There was no small talk, no easy laughter, no moment where everyone leaned back and relaxed. From the very first exchange, something was alive in that room. Something electric and uncomfortable, and the audience felt it before they could even name it. This was a conversation that started with a compliment and ended with a confrontation, and somewhere in the middle, Viola Davis said something so direct, so composed, and so devastating that the entire panel fell silent. You need to see how this played out. Stay with us, drop a comment, and subscribe, because this is the kind of moment that only happens live, and only happens when someone like Viola Davis decides she is done being handled. Now, let us set the scene. The View is not a soft room. It never has been. Joy Behar has been doing this for decades, and she did not get to where she is by asking gentle questions. She is sharp, she is political, she is unafraid to push, and on most days, that combination works perfectly. Guests come in, they promote their project, they laugh through the hard questions, they leave. That is the rhythm of the show. That is what everyone expects. But Viola Davis does not do rhythm, she does truth. When she walked out and settled into that seat across from the panel, the energy in the studio shifted. The audience applauded, as they always do. The host smiled, as they always do. And then Joy Behar opened her mouth, and instead of starting somewhere safe, she started somewhere sharp. Joy looked directly at Viola and said, with that particular tone she has, the one that sounds casual but carries an edge underneath it, "You know, I have to ask you something, because you are someone who speaks very openly about race in Hollywood. And I want to know if you think things have actually changed, or if it is all just talk at this point." The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. You could hear the ripple. Now, most guests, when faced with that kind of opening question, do one of two things. They either give a polished, rehearsed answer that says everything and nothing, or they deflect with a joke and steer towards safer ground. The audience has seen it 1,000 times. The hosts have seen it 1,000 times. Everyone knows the dance. Viola Davis did not dance. She looked at Joy, and there was a pause. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not the kind that signals hesitation, but the kind that signals that the person across from you is choosing their words with the precision of someone who has thought about this longer and harder than you have. And then she said, calm and clear, "I think when you ask if things have changed, you have to be willing to sit with a complicated answer, because the easy answer is yes. The honest answer is, it depends on who you ask and what they are being asked to survive." Joy raised an eyebrow. She leaned forward slightly, the way she does when she senses a debate forming. "But you have won the Oscar. You have won the Emmy. You have the career. Does that not say something about the industry?" And here is where things started to shift. Because Viola did not bristle. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage for the cameras. She simply said, "It says something about me. I am not sure it says what you think it says about the industry." The audience reacted, not loudly. It was more of a collective intake of breath. That particular sound a crowd makes when someone says the thing that everyone felt, but no one expected to actually be said out loud. Joy, to her credit, did not back down immediately. She pushed, but surely the fact that you are sitting here, that you have been able to build what you have built, proves that the door is open. Viola tilted her head slightly and said, "Joy, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. How many doors do you think I had to knock on before I found the one that would open? And how many women who were just as talented, just as prepared, just as hungry as I was, knocked on those same doors and were never let in? You see, one person who made it through. I see all the people who did not." The table went quiet, not the awkward quiet of a conversation that has gone wrong. The reverent quiet of a conversation that has suddenly gone very right in a way that no one quite anticipated. Joy sat with that for a moment, and then she tried a different angle. "Okay, but I think there is a difference between saying the industry has a long way to go and saying it is fundamentally broken. Would you say it is broken?" Viola looked at her with an expression that was almost gentle, and said, "I would say it was never designed for me to succeed in it, and I would say that anything I have achieved in spite of that design, not because of it. Now, you can call that broken if you want. I call it honest." Joy leaned back. One of the other hosts shifted in her seat. The audience was completely still, and this is the part of the story where most people would expect the interview to cool down, to find a softer moment, to let everyone breathe. This is usually where a commercial break saves everyone involved. But there was no commercial break. Not yet. And Joy Behar was not finished. She looked at Viola and said, with that particular mix of challenge and curiosity that she is known for, "You know what I find interesting? You have been very vocal about Hollywood, about race, about opportunity. But you are also someone who has chosen to play some very specific kinds of roles. And I wonder if there is a tension there, if there is a part of you that has had to compromise in order to get to where you are. The room shifted again, differently this time, because that question was not just a question, it was an accusation wearing the clothes of a question. And Viola Davis felt it, the audience felt it, everyone at that table felt it. Viola did not flinch. She looked at Joy Behar with the full weight of her attention, and she said, "Say what you mean, Joy." 3 words, quiet, absolute. The studio held its breath. Joy blinked, and for just a moment, she looked like someone who had thrown a punch and found the other person had not moved an inch. She recovered quickly, the way someone with her experience always does. And she said, "I mean, some of your earlier roles. People have criticized them. Academics, critics, members of your own community. And I am wondering how you respond to that." Viola nodded slowly, and then she said something that no one in that room, and no one watching at home, was quite ready for. "Joy, I grew up so poor that I did not have running water in my house. I grew up in a neighborhood where people were not thinking about Oscar campaigns or critical discourse. They were thinking about survival. And when I got the chance to work, I worked. Every single time. Not because I was not aware of the conversation around those roles, but because every character I have ever played, I made sure she had a heartbeat. I made sure she was a human being, not a symbol, not a stereotype, not a cautionary tale. A person. And if someone wants to have a conversation about the kinds of roles that get offered to black women in Hollywood, I am more than ready to have that conversation. But do not sit across from me and suggest that I compromised my integrity to get here, because I promise you, I did not." The applause started before she even finished the sentence. And Joy Behar, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, looked like she had underestimated the person sitting across from her. But here is the thing, this was not even the moment that everyone would be talking about, because after the applause died down, after the room settled, Joy Behar leaned in one more time, and what she said next, and what Viola Davis said in response, is what truly made this interview something people could not stop thinking about. We are getting there. Keep watching. The applause had settled. The room had found its breath again, and anyone watching at home who thought the hardest part of this conversation was behind them, was about to find out they were wrong. Joy Behar has a gift, and that gift is the ability to make a pivot feel natural. To move from one pressure point to the next without the audience quite realizing that the pressure has never actually let up. She smiled. She nodded, the way someone does when they are acknowledging what was just said while simultaneously preparing to challenge it. And then she said, "I hear you. I do. But I want to go somewhere else for a second, because I think there is something you said that is worth pulling on. You talked about humanity, about making sure your characters feel like real people. And I think that is beautiful. But there are people, serious people, who would argue that good intentions are not enough. That the cumulative effect of certain images, regardless of the intention behind them, does real damage to real communities. How do you answer that?" It was a smarter question than the last one. More layered, harder to sidestep. And Joy knew it. Viola looked at her for a moment, and then she said, "I think those are important conversations. I genuinely do. But I want to ask you something, Joy, because I think it matters. When we talk about the damage that images do, who are we holding responsible? Are we holding responsible the actor who took the job and brought every ounce of her craft to it? Or are we holding responsible the system that decides which stories get funded, which scripts get greenlit, which writers get hired, and which perspectives get centered? Because those are 2 very different conversations. And I find that the second conversation is a lot harder to have, so people keep pulling the first one back into the room. Joy leaned in. "But you are part of the system now. You produced, you have a company, you have power. So does that argument still hold?" Viola did not miss a beat. Having power inside a system does not mean you built the system. And it does not mean the system bends to your will the moment you get a seat at the table. What it means is that you fight differently. You fight from the inside instead of the outside. But you are still fighting. Anyone who tells you that reaching a certain level of success means the fight is over has never actually been in the fight. One of the other hosts, who had been largely quiet up to this point, nodded visibly. The audience responded warmly, and for just a moment, it felt like the conversation might find a more collaborative footing. Joy let that moment breathe. And then she said, "Can I ask you something more personal?" Viola said, "You can ask." There was something in that answer. Not a yes, exactly. An openness with a boundary built into it. Joy heard it. She continued, "Anyway, you have spoken in interviews, very powerfully, about your childhood, about poverty, about trauma, about what it took to get from where you started to where you are. And I think people find that story incredibly inspiring. But I also wonder, and this is genuine curiosity, not a challenge, whether there is a part of you that is tired of that story being the thing people lead with. Like, does it ever feel like people are more comfortable celebrating where you came from than engaging with what you were actually saying right now?" The room stilled, because it was unexpectedly a good question, a real question, the kind Joy Behar is capable of when she sets the performance aside and operates from genuine instinct. Viola looked at her, and something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but deepened. She said, yes, it does. Because the origin story is easy to consume. It is a straight line from suffering to triumph, and everyone knows how to feel about that. But the things I am saying right now, the things I have been saying for years about this industry, about opportunity, about who gets to tell what stories and why. Those things make people uncomfortable, and discomfort is harder to applaud. So yes, I am aware of which version of me is easier for rooms like this one to celebrate. Joy was quiet for a second. Then she said, almost carefully, rooms like this one. Yes, Viola said, simply. Without apology. Joy tilted her head. You think we take the easy version of you. I think, Viola said, that every interview I do, there is a version of me that the room wants. The version that is grateful and warm, and tells the story of how far she has come, and makes everyone feel good about the world. And then, there is the version of me that actually showed up today. And I am watching, in real time, to see which one this conversation is going to make room for. The audience reacted strongly to that. Not just applause, something more active than applause. Something closer to recognition. Joy said, well, for what it is worth, I think the version that actually showed up today is a lot more interesting. Viola said, I know, that is why I brought her. The laughter that followed was real, and for a brief moment, the tension between them transformed into something that looked almost like respect. Two sharp people, acknowledging each other across a table, but Joy Behar did not become who she is. By leaving well enough alone. She waited for the laughter to settle, and then she said, okay, I want to go somewhere that I think is going to be interesting. You have been very outspoken about the wage gap in Hollywood, specifically around race. And there was a moment, a very public moment, where you spoke about being paid significantly less than your white counterparts. I want to ask you directly, when you found out, what did you do? And what did the industry do in response? Viola's jaw set, just slightly, not in anger, in precision. The way a person looks when they are about to say something they have said before, in their head, many times, but are choosing in this moment to say out loud, for the record, what did I do? She said, I said it out loud, which, in that industry, in those circles, is considered a radical act. You do not talk about money. You do not compare notes. You do not name the gap, because naming it makes it real, and making it real means someone has to do something about it. So I named it. And what happened? People called it brave. They wrote articles. They had panels. And then the next project came along, and the gap was still there. Because bravery makes for a great headline, but it does not automatically change a contract. Joy said, that is cynical. Viola looked at her and said, that is accurate. There is a difference. Joy pushed. But things have moved. Pay equity conversations are happening at every major studio now. Viola said, conversations are happening. Yes, I will not argue with that. But I want you to think about the distance between a conversation happening and equity actually existing. Because I have sat in rooms where people talked beautifully about change, and then went back to their offices and signed the same contracts they always signed. Words are not policy. Statements are not action. And I think one of the things that frustrates me most, and I will say this clearly, is when people in positions of platform, and I am including myself in that, confuse raising awareness with creating change. They are not the same thing. And the people who suffer the gap are not comforted by the conversation about the gap, Joy said. So what is the answer? Viola said, the answer is accountability. Specific, documented, structural accountability, not a statement, not a diversity initiative that lives in the marketing department. Actual accountability. Who is being hired? Who is being paid what? And who is answering for the difference? Joy nodded slowly. Then she said, and do you think this industry is capable of that? Viola looked at her. And then she said something that landed like a door closing. I think this industry is capable of anything it is forced to be capable of. The question is whether the people with the power to force it are willing to spend that power. And so far, most of them are not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of what had just been said, full of the audience processing it, full of Joy Behar sitting across from a woman who had just drawn a line in the clearest possible language. But and then Joy said something that no one expected, something that changed the entire temperature of the room. She said, can I be honest with you about something? Viola said, please. And what Joy Behar said next, and how Viola Davis responded to it, is the moment that this entire conversation had been building to, the moment that people who watched it said they could not stop thinking about for days. We are almost there. Do not go anywhere. Joy Behar had just asked for honesty, and the room, the audience, the panel, everyone watching at home, leaned in at exactly the same time, because here is the thing about Joy Behar that people sometimes forget. Underneath the sharpness and the debate and the decades of television, she is not performing ignorance. She is not pretending to be unaware of the world. She has lived long enough, watched enough, argued enough, to know when a conversation has outgrown the format it was supposed to fit inside, and something about sitting across from Viola Davis, something about the precision and the patience and the refusal to flinch, had pulled something genuine to the surface. She said, I think I came into this conversation with a frame, And I think you have been dismantling that frame for the last 20 minutes, piece by piece, and I am not sure I have been fully honest with myself about that. Viola looked at her, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of someone who has won a point, with something quieter than that, attention, real attention. She said, "What was the frame?" Joy said, "I think I came in here expecting to have a conversation about progress, about how far things have come. And I think, somewhere underneath that, I wanted you to validate that, to say yes, things are better, look at what you have achieved, look at what is possible. And instead you have been sitting here telling me the truth, and the truth is more complicated than the story I came in ready to tell." Viola was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Why do you think you wanted that validation?" Joy paused. It was not a pause she performed, it was a pause she needed, because, she said, slowly, "I think it is easier to celebrate progress than to sit with how much has not changed. And I think people like me, people who consider themselves progressive, who have spent their careers pushing back on injustice, sometimes need the story of progress more than anyone. Because without it, we have to ask ourselves what we actually did with all that time." The studio was so quiet you could have heard a breath. Viola looked at Joy Behar, and she said, "And every word was measured, and every word was exact. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in an interview in a very long time." Joy let out a breath. "Well, you made it impossible to be anything else." "Good," Viola said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, she smiled. Not the polished smile of someone who is happy to be there, the real one, the one that reaches the eyes. But Viola was not finished, because she had something she wanted to say, and the opening had just arrived. She said, "Can I tell you what I think the real problem is? Not just in Hollywood, not just in this industry, but in the broader conversation about race and equity and opportunity in this country." Joy said, "Please." Viola said, "The real problem is that we have confused visibility with power. We have confused representation with equity. We see a black woman on a billboard, a black director on a magazine cover, a black actress holding a trophy, and we say, look, things are changing. And what we do not say, what we do not ask, is who owns the billboard? Who owns the magazine? Who produced the film that led to the trophy? Because visibility without ownership is just decoration. It makes people feel good. It makes great television. But it does not transfer wealth. It does not build institutions. It does not close the gap. It just makes the gap prettier." One of the other hosts said, quietly, almost to herself, "Visibility without ownership is just decoration." Viola heard her. She nodded. "I have been saying that for years. In rooms a lot less comfortable than this one. And every time I say it, people nod. People agree. People post it. And then the structure stays exactly where it was." Joy said, "So what would change that?" "In your view," Viola said, "investment. Actual financial investment in black-owned production companies, black-owned studios, black storytellers who are not being asked to filter their stories through someone else's comfort level before they can get made, not grants, not fellowships, not programs with beautiful names that fund 3 projects and disappear. Sustained, structural, financial investment, the same kind that built every major studio that exists. Because those studios were not built on talent alone. They were built on capital, and capital has never flowed equally. And until it does, the conversation about representation is just a conversation." Joy said, "You make it sound very simple." Viola said, "It is simple. It is not easy, but it is simple. People confuse those two things constantly. The solution is clear. The will to execute it is what is missing." Joy looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to push back on one thing, because I think you are someone who has used your platform, your voice, your company, to do exactly what you are describing. And I wonder if that story, your specific story of using power to try to build something different, is one that gets told enough. Because I hear a lot of critique in what you are saying, and I think the critique is right. But I also wonder if the model you represent is something people know about." Viola said, "I appreciate that. I genuinely do. But I want to be careful about something. Because the moment I become the example, the moment my story becomes the proof that the system works, we are right back to the beginning. One person is not a system. One company is not equity. I do not want to be the exception that lets everyone off the hook. I want to be one of many. And right now, there are not enough of many." Joy nodded, and then she said something unexpected. She said, "I owe you an apology." Viola looked at her. "For what?" Joy said, "For some of the earlier questions, I came in with a frame, like I said, and some of those questions were designed to fit that frame rather than to actually hear what you had to say, and you handled that with a lot more grace than I would have." Viola said, "You do not need to apologize for asking hard questions. That is your job. What I needed, and what I think this conversation eventually found, was for the questions to be in service of truth rather than in service of a comfortable conclusion. And I think we got there." Joy said, "We got there." And then, after a beat, Viola said, "Eventually." The laughter that followed was the warmest of the entire interview, and in it was something that the first 20 minutes of the conversation had not had. The sense that two people, across a table, across very different lives and very different vantage points, had actually reached each other. But Viola had one more thing to say, and she said it without being asked. She said it because the moment was right, and because she had clearly been carrying it in, waiting for exactly this kind of space. She said, "You know what I want? Not for myself. I have built what I have built, but for the next generation. I want a young black girl, somewhere in this country, in a neighborhood like the one I grew up in, to be able to walk into this industry and not have to be exceptional to survive it. I want ordinary to be enough. Because in every other corner of this industry, ordinary is enough. Ordinary white mediocrity gets funded, gets greenlit, gets celebrated, gets a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance. An extraordinary black excellence gets one shot and a conversation about whether it was the right kind of excellent. I want ordinary to be enough. That is what equity actually looks like. Not the exceptional ones making it through. Everyone having a real shot." Nobody said anything for a moment. Joy Behar, who has sat at that table through decades of television, through arguments and controversies and moments that people still talk about, looked at Viola Davis and said, very quietly, "That is what I am going to be thinking about for a long time." Viola said, "Good, that is all I ask." And that was it. Not a dramatic explosion, not a shouting match, not a moment where someone stormed off or a host lost her composure. Something rarer than all of that. A moment where two people, live, on camera, in front of a studio audience, chose truth over performance. And the one who pushed hardest for that truth, from the very first word to the very last, was Viola Davis. She did not come to The View to be celebrated. She did not come to be comfortable. She came to say exactly what she meant, to hold her ground under every question, to dismantle every frame that was built around her, and to leave the room changed. And she did all of it without raising her voice once. That is not a television moment. That is a masterclass. And if you made it to the end of this video, then you already know you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. So go ahead and subscribe if you have not already, because we break down moments like this one every single week. The conversations that go beyond the headlines, the exchanges that actually mean something. And before you go, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us this. Do you think Viola Davis was right when she said that visibility without ownership is just decoration? Let us know where you stand. We read every single one.